First Contact Protocol. The morning sun spilled across Nebraska's endless cornfields as Elara Jones made her final adjustments to the irrigation system. At 32, she was considered something of an oddity in Harding County, a Ph.D. in agricultural engineering who'd chosen to return home rather than take prestigious positions at research institutions. Today marked the third week of testing her new drought-resistant farming method, a system that used 70% less water while increasing crop yields by nearly 20%. Looking good, Dr. Jones called Marcus, the oldest of her three assistants, as he checked soil moisture readings. The eastern quadrant still needs fine-tuning, Elara replied, brushing dirt from her hands. And for the 1000th time, just call me Elara. Marcus grinned. Not a chance. My mama raised me right. Elara was about to respond when she noticed something strange in the clear morning sky. A shimmer, like heat rising from asphalt, except it was spreading across the entire horizon. She squinted, shielding her eyes from the sun. "Do you see that?" she asked, pointing upward. Marcus followed her gaze. Probably just a weather balloon more. The air rippled, and suddenly, it wasn't empty anymore. A massive shape materialized above them, its surface reflecting the sunlight in iridescent patterns. The object was roughly oval-shaped, perhaps a quarter-mile long, hovering silently above the Nebraska farmland. "Holy shit," Marcus whispered. Within minutes, their phones began blaring emergency alerts. All across the world, similar vessels had appeared over major cities: New York, Beijing, London, Moscow, Tokyo. The news channels scrambled to provide coverage, military jets scrambled to establish perimeters, and governments issued conflicting statements ranging from calls for calm to preparations for possible hostilities. By evening, Elara sat in her farmhouse kitchen, television broadcasting continuous emergency updates while she fiddled with the old ham radio equipment that had belonged to her father. None of the alien vessels had made any aggressive moves, but they hadn't communicated either. The world held its breath, waiting. Elara wasn't just any farmer with a ham radio, though. Her specialty might be agricultural engineering, but she'd been modifying communications equipment since childhood. Her current setup incorporated components she'd designed herself, capable of scanning frequencies most commercial equipment couldn't detect. As she adjusted the dials, a burst of static suddenly gave way to something else, a pattern, rhythmic and deliberate. Not language exactly, but something that tickled the analytical part of her brain, like a complex mathematical equation expressed as sound. She grabbed a notebook and began scribbling, trying to map the patterns. Hours passed as she worked, the patterns gradually resolving into something that seemed almost comprehensible. There was a logic to it, a structure that reminded her of the algorithms she used for optimizing water distribution in her irrigation systems. By dawn, Elara had done something impossible. She'd begun to understand. The transmission wasn't a message so much as a system diagnostic, the alien equivalent of check engine warnings, broadcasting on frequencies that human technology normally wouldn't detect. But her modified equipment, designed to monitor subtle electromagnetic changes in soil moisture, was sensitive to precisely those frequencies. Drawing on everything she knew about systems engineering, Elara crafted a response using the same mathematical patterns, a simple acknowledgement that the transmission had been received and understood. She didn't expect an answer, not really. It was scientific curiosity, an engineer's instinct to solve a puzzle. But an answer came. The radio crackled with a new pattern, similar but distinct, like a question. And beyond her window, the massive ship that had been hovering motionless for nearly 24 hours suddenly shifted, rotating slowly until what might have been its front end pointed directly at her farmhouse. 3 hours later, black SUVs with government plates rolled up her driveway. Men and women in suits piled out, followed by military personnel who began setting up equipment around her property. Dr. Elara Jones, a tall woman in a charcoal suit, approached, flanked by two serious-looking men. "I'm Director Helena Reeves, National Security Council. We need to talk about the transmission you sent. Ilara crossed her arms. How did you know about that? We've been monitoring all communications since the vessels appeared. Yours is the only one that received a response. The next few hours were a whirlwind of questions, equipment checks, and barely veiled threats about national security. Government scientists examined her modified radio, expressing both skepticism and reluctant admiration for her improvised setup. It shouldn't work, one muttered. But somehow she's tapped into exactly the right frequency modulation. Director Reeves pulled Ilara aside. We need you to send another message, carefully scripted by our linguists and approved by the Joint Chiefs. That won't work, Ilara said, frustration mounting. They're not communicating in language. It's mathematical, systems-based. They responded to me because I spoke to them in terms they understood. Ms. Jones. Dr. Jones. Dr. Jones, this is a matter of global security. We can't have a civilian conducting first contact. Before Ilara could argue further, a military officer burst into the room. Director, you need to see this. Outside, the massive ship had descended lower, now hovering just 300 feet above the cornfields. A beam of light emanated from its underside, projecting an image onto the ground, a geometric pattern that slowly resolved into a recognizable shape, a simplified human figure standing alone, followed by the same figure approaching what appeared to be the ship. They're requesting a meeting, Ilara said. Absolutely not. Director Reeves began, but another transmission interrupted her, this one blaring from every speaker in the house, every phone, even the military equipment. It wasn't the mathematical pattern anymore. It was a voice, synthesized and strange, but unmistakably English. Ilara Jones. Communication established. Assistance required. Others not suitable. The military personnel raised their weapons instinctively, though there was nothing to shoot at. Director Reeves looked pale. How do they know your name? She demanded. Ilara shrugged. They didn't. I signed my transmission with it. Mathematical representation of the letters. Ms. Jones, you are not authorized to. They've studied us. Ilara interrupted, realization dawning. That's why they can suddenly speak English. They've been monitoring our communications, probably for years. They just needed someone to establish the initial protocol, someone who could understand their systems. The voice came again. Ilara Jones. Time critical. Others not suitable. Director Reeves conferred hurriedly with her team, then approached Ilara with a grim expression. We don't have a choice, do we? I don't think so, Ilara replied, staring up at the massive ship. Within an hour, she found herself being fitted with monitoring equipment, a subdermal tracker, vital sign monitors, and multiple cameras. If you show any signs of distress, we'll attempt extraction. A military officer explained as technicians checked her equipment. With what? Ilara asked. Fighter jets against a ship that can appear and disappear at will. Nobody answered. As Ilara walked alone across her cornfield toward the beam of light, she felt strangely calm. The analytical part of her mind cataloged everything. The weight of the monitoring equipment, the feel of corn stalks brushing against her hands, the steady hum emanating from the ship above. The light enveloped her, and gravity seemed to shift. She felt herself rising, floating upward into an opening that had appeared in the vessel's underside. The last thing she saw before the opening closed beneath her was the cluster of government vehicles growing smaller black dots against the green and gold patchwork of Nebraska farmland. Then she was inside, surrounded by curved surfaces that glowed with soft, pulsing light. The air had a strange quality, thicker somehow, with a faint scent like ozone after a lightning strike. A figure stepped forward from a curved doorway, humanoid but clearly not human. Nearly 7 feet tall with elongated limbs and a torso that seemed too narrow. Its skin was a pale bluish-gray that rippled occasionally with subtle bioluminescence. The head was the most alien feature, no visible ears, a minimal nose, and large, multifaceted eyes that reflected light like insect eyes. though they were clearly set in a face with recognizable features. Elara Jones, it said, the voice coming not from the being itself, but from all around her. I am Navigator Corvo of the Valerian science vessel Nexus 7. We require your assistance. Elara took a deep breath, feeling the weight of human history on her shoulders. I'm listening. Seeds of partnership. The corridors of the Nexus 7 curved in ways that seemed to defy Euclidean geometry, leading Elara deeper into the ship. Navigator Corvo moved with fluid grace, occasionally touching walls that responded with pulses of light and subtle color changes. Our species has observed Earth for 73 of your years, Corvo explained, multifaceted eyes reflecting the ship's ambient light. We have studied your languages, your technologies, your conflicts, but we never anticipated requiring human assistance. Why me? Elara asked. I'm an agricultural engineer, not a physicist or diplomat. Precisely, Corvo replied. Our need is biological, not mechanical. They entered a vast chamber that took Elara's breath away. The room was a contained ecosystem, plants unlike anything she ever seen growing in spiral patterns around a central light source. But something was clearly wrong. Many of the plants were wilting, their colors faded from what she assumed were once vibrant hues. This is our primary sustenance chamber, Corvo explained. One of 17 aboard the Nexus 7. All are failing. Elara approached a nearby plant, a fern-like organism with translucent fronds that pulsed weakly with bioluminescence. Your food is dying. Yes, our biologists cannot determine the cause. Our ship's journey has lasted longer than anticipated. Without functioning sustenance chambers, the crew of 4,000 will not survive the journey home. The implications weren't lost on Elara. A desperate, starving alien crew might be forced to look elsewhere for sustenance, like the abundant biological resources of Earth. I'll need to understand your plant's normal growth cycles, nutritional requirements, everything about your ecosystem, she said, already examining the nearest specimens. Hours stretched into days as Elara worked alongside Valerian biologists, learning about alien biochemistry while applying principles of terrestrial agriculture. The aliens provided a neural interface that allowed direct information exchange, flooding her mind with knowledge that would have taken years to acquire through conventional study. She learned that the Valerians were explorers and scientists, part of an interstellar collective that had been observing Earth since humans first launched satellites into orbit. Their policy was non-interference until a species achieved certain technological milestones humanity was rapidly approaching. The Nexus 7 had been on a 15-year mission cataloging potentially habitable worlds when their biological systems began failing. Earth was the nearest planet with compatible technology and agricultural expertise. On the fourth day, Elara identified the problem. It's not a disease or parasite, she explained to Corvo as they stood in the central sustenance chamber. It's your light source. The spectrum has shifted by 0.3% toward the blue end, barely detectable by your instruments, but enough to disrupt the photosynthetic process for these plants. Corvo's skin rippled with bioluminescent patterns that Elara had learned to recognize as surprise. How could you determine this when our biologists could not? Elara smiled. Farming isn't just science, it's observation, intuition. My grandfather could predict crop failures by the way dew formed on corn silk. I've spent my life studying how subtle environmental changes affect growing things. Fixing the light spectrum was relatively simple once the problem was identified, but the damaged plants wouldn't recover quickly enough. The Valerians needed a temporary solution while their ecosystem regenerated. Elara proposed something radical, a hybrid growing system incorporating earth crops that she'd brought aboard. Seeds from her own experimental varieties, modified to grow quickly and produced high nutrient yields. The Valerian High Council initially rejected the idea of integrating alien biology into their carefully balanced ecosystem. But as food reserves dwindled, they reconsidered. Using techniques she'd developed for her drought-resistant farming system, Elara created growing chambers where Earth plants could supplement the failing Valerian crops. The aliens watched with a mixture of skepticism and fascination as corn, wheat, and soybean seedlings emerged from the soil mixture she'd engineered from ship resources. During this time, Ilara and Corvo developed an unusual friendship. The navigator was assigned as her permanent liaison, and they spent hours discussing their respective worlds. Corvo was particularly fascinated by human art and music, concepts that had no direct Valerian equivalent. "Your species creates without practical purpose," Corvo observed one evening as they monitored the new hybrid growing chambers. "It is inefficient but beautiful." "That inefficiency is part of what makes us human," Ilara replied. "We don't just solve problems. We dream beyond them." 3 weeks into her stay aboard the Nexus 7, disaster struck. Ilara awoke to blaring alarms and flickering lights. She found Corvo outside her quarters, skin pulsing with urgent patterns. "The main environmental system is failing," the navigator explained. "Oxygen levels are dropping throughout the ship." In the central control chamber, Valerian technicians worked frantically to identify the cause. Ilara studied the diagnostic displays, the alien symbols now familiar after weeks of neural interface learning. "This isn't a malfunction," she said suddenly. "These patterns are too systematic. Someone did this deliberately." Corvo's skin darkened, the Valerian equivalent of blanching. "Impossible. No crew member would." "Maybe not a crew member," Ilara interrupted. She pulled up surveillance feeds, scanning through them until she spotted something. A maintenance drone behaving abnormally, accessing systems outside its programmed parameters. "There," she pointed. "That drone has been reprogrammed." Security teams were dispatched, but the damage was already done. The ship's environmental systems were locked in a terminal shutdown sequence that would render the vessel uninhabitable within hours. "We must evacuate to Earth," one of the Valerian Council members declared. 4,000 aliens suddenly appearing on Earth would cause panic, Ilara argued. "There has to be another way." She studied the ship's systems, looking for a solution. The Valerians had designed their technology with multiple redundancies and failsafes, but that same careful engineering made it difficult to implement unconventional fixes. "Your systems are too perfect," she told Corvo. "Too interdependent. On Earth, we build things expecting them to break, so we can fix them in the field with whatever's available." An idea began to form. The hybrid growing chambers she created used a modified version of her irrigation system, a system designed to operate independently during power failures. "We need to create a secondary environmental system," she explained. "Something the saboteur couldn't anticipate because it's not part of your standard technology." Using components from her hybrid growing chambers and principles from her Earth-based systems, Ilara designed an emergency oxygen generation system. It was crude by Valerian standards, a patchwork of alien technology and agricultural engineering principles, but it would provide enough life support to keep the crew alive, while the main systems were repaired. As they worked, Corvo revealed the likely culprit, a splinter faction within Valerian society that opposed contact with primitive species like humans. They believed that any technological exchange would contaminate Valerian culture. "The saboteur probably expected us to evacuate to Earth," Corvo explained, creating exactly the situation they wished to prevent. "Ironic," Ilara replied as she calibrated the makeshift system. "They're being saved by the primitive human they tried to get rid of." The emergency system came online just as the primary systems failed. Throughout the massive ship, thousands of Valerians watched in surprise as crude but effective Earth technology kept them alive. The saboteur, a junior technician with connections to the isolationist faction, was eventually captured. The primary systems were restored within days, but the incident had profound implications for Valerian-human relations. In the aftermath, the Valerian High Council made an unprecedented decision. Usually, they would simply repair their ship and depart, wiping the memory of any indigenous species they had been forced to contact. But Ilara's contributions had saved the ship and demonstrated that humans possessed valuable insights despite their relatively limited technology. "Your species approaches problems differently," the head counselor told Ilara in a formal ceremony. "Where we seek perfection, you embrace adaptation. Both approaches have merit." The council proposed a limited cultural and technological exchange, the first in Valerian history with a pre-FTL civilization. Earth would not receive advanced technology that might disrupt its natural development, but cooperative research in agriculture, medicine, and environmental science would be permitted. As the designated first contact, Ilara was offered a position as the human liaison to the Valerian mission that would remain in Earth orbit, a role that would make her the first human ambassador to an alien civilization. "I'm just a farmer from Nebraska," she told Corvo as they stood in the now thriving hybrid garden. Earth crops grew alongside recovering Valerian plants, the two alien biologies finding an unexpected harmony. "Perhaps that is exactly what the universe needed," Corvo replied, multifaceted eyes reflecting the garden's lights. "Not a diplomat or scientist with preconceived notions, but someone who understands that different systems can grow together, given the right conditions." As the Nexus 7 moved into permanent Earth orbit, humanity took its first steps into a larger universe, not through conquest or technological superiority, but through a farmer's understanding that all living things, no matter how alien, share fundamental needs and a capacity to adapt. The seeds of partnership had been planted. What would grow from them remained to be seen.